everyone. Thanks for joining us again. I see a number of familiar faces, but also some new people. So very, very briefly, so my name is Jürgen Wispelaar. I'm a visiting professor here at the Godswerner Chair of Economic Policy and Constitutional Theory. I hope I got that right. Sounds about right. So this is this is basically the freebies public lecture series, which is also part of an MA course run by the Godswerner Chair. So we're now at lecture 5 already out of 6. So this is the last week, and there'll be one more on Wednesday by Lara Rincon. I'm already giving you advance warning here. The whole purpose of this lecture series was to introduce people to 6, leading articles that I think I really have contributed interesting ways into the sort of the very, very recent debates in basic income policy development. And, the idea was basically we have the guest lecturers themselves introducing their articles. They will talk for half an hour, and then we have half an hour for questions, right? So we'll get to the question thing after Tim is finished. So it's my absolute pleasure today to introduce a good mate and excellent scholar, Tim Vlandas, who is Associate Professor of Comparative Social Policy at the University of Oxford. So Tim basically works on political economy, comparative political economy, if you like, and on an amazing number of topics, actually. So, labor markets is one, the far right is one, COVID now, political economy of COVID, aging and aging societies, and so on and so forth. And then basic income is one as well. So this is only one. I actually lost count. Is it 3 or 4 papers or even more at the moment that Tim has written? And they're all quite connected. So if you're interested in his work, you should check out his website, and you should actually, really look at some of these other papers as well. It really develops a fascinating approach to studying the political economy very, very specifically of basic income. So Tim, without further ado, I'm just going to give you the floor after this bumbling introduction.
Jürgen, many thanks for this incredibly generous introduction, and delighted to be here today to talk to you about this paper that we agreed with. Jürgen might provide an interesting basis for the discussion. So as Jürgen said, I'm coming at this topic from a political economy perspective, and I say a little bit more about what I mean by that. But basically, this is the title of the paper here that I will be presenting in the next 30 minutes or so. It's entitled "The Political Economy of Individual Level Support for the Basic Income in Europe." And the idea in the paper was to try and think about the ways in which different people might support or oppose the idea of a basic income, and what kinds of characteristics these people have that make them more or less likely to do so, with a particular view in thinking about whether or not the ways that the political economy literature has looked at support for existing policies, think unemployment benefits or social assistance or pension benefits or education, do these frameworks that we've used coming at it from this other literature translate, or do they have any kind of analytical leverage in understanding what's going on with basic income? And so what I want to do is not so much tell you a lot about basic income itself. Jürgen told me that in previous talks and in the other readings that people taking this course have done, there's a lot of material already explaining what a basic income is and how it's structured and how it might operate. I want to just explain how it relates to political economy perspective, then introduce this perspective, and then tell you about one way in which we can explore this question empirically, which I've done in this paper, but of course it's not the only way, give you some results, and then perhaps open up a bit for a discussion and thinking about the ways in which this might or might not have wider implications for how we ought to think about the political viability of a basic income going forward. So just to start with a definition, as you know, basic income is different in a number of ways from existing welfare state benefits. So unlike social assistance, it isn't targeted, it's universal. And it isn't means tested, so it doesn't require people to comply with certain conditions. You could imagine income thresholds, or in some cases now increasingly behavioral requirements. And unlike social insurance, it doesn't require prior contribution. It just requires you to be a part of the polity in which a basic income would be introduced. The cash payment element of it also differs from public services, which tend to be in kind, right? And that matters because the differences in which basic income might be observed with social insurance, public services, and social assistance then means that different kinds of people might be favorable or against basic income, and then tells you something about the possible coalition. The graph here on the right-hand side is just to show that everyone would start from a minimum level, and depending on how much work they put in, they would then get more. But this, of course, assumes a particular tax structure, and you could think of different financing models that would mean that there are different kinds of effects on different people. And I'll tell you a bit more about what that implies then for how we ought to think about who might like or dislike the idea of a basic income. Now, I don't want to go here through the whole history and development of the idea itself. Others are much more qualified than I am to do so. But I just want to say that although the idea of a basic income is very, very long-standing, you see waning and increasing interest at different points in time. And most recently, you've had a bit of an uptick because although in the 1980s, you had perhaps quite a lot of interest, and this is where the Basic Income Earth Network was created, and you saw lots of academic writings in that part of the century on basic income. Then, in the 1990s, perhaps it wasn't, so much front and center of public debates, at least in Europe and in the US. But then suddenly, after the crisis, and most recently in COVID, you see a lot of interest in different places. So you have the referendum in Switzerland. One of the main presidential candidates in France, Benoît Hamon, proposes a universal basic income as part of his agenda. He later backtracked a bit, but that's a different story. You had the Finnish experiment. And then most recently during COVID, you really have a lot of discussions of whether the kind of pandemic shock that we experienced put the welfare state under pressure in a way that then called for basic income. Now, the reason why I think that's important is because this, in a way, started to get me thinking about something that perhaps had received comparatively less attention in literature, namely the political feasibility, and what I call the gap that wasn't there for good reason in the literature. So typically, people who've debated and looked at and studied universal basic income have done so from two perspectives. One focusing mostly on its normative desirability. Should we introduce a basic income? Ought we to desire such a scheme? Would it be fair? Would it be just? What kinds of normative rationales and justifications might we adopt to support or oppose the idea of a basic income? So that's for the more political theory and philosophy inclined treatments on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have a much more pragmatic financial and economic assessment. Would it be fiscally the evidence base, and this is what's been driving recent experiments that other speakers might have discussed. And I think this is all very important, but as a political economist, what I tend to study is why we get the welfare state benefits that we do get, why different countries at different points in time have more or less generous welfare states. And therefore, that raises the question of what it is that would make a universal basic income not so much normatively desirable and not so much economically feasible, but politically feasible. And given that we live in democracies, a major constraint or driving force for these kinds of decision is the distribution of preferences and interest in the electorate. So this is what the paper focuses on. And the starting point is to think about the nature of different cleavages in an electorate. And this is something that I take from existing political economy scholarship on the welfare state. And typically people distinguish between two very big dimensions. One is the Robin Hood dimension. So you can think of it as people with higher income tending to be more opposed to redistribution because it hurts their interest. And people with lower income being more favorable because they presumably would benefit from redistribution. Cutting across to a certain extent this kind of Robin Hood income-based dimension, you have a more risk-based, what Nick Barr calls the piggy bank function of the welfare state, which is the notion that whether you're low income or high income, you're exposed to different kinds of risks. You might become sick, you might lose your job, you might have other kinds of negative events, and you rely on the welfare state to insure you against these negative events. So here you can imagine that people who are on low incomes and high risks are very favorable to the welfare state because they, in a way, stand to gain quite a bit. And people who have very high income and very low risk would be opposed. And then the two remaining quadrants tend to be crush-threshold. Now, at this stage, I hasten to add, comes a question, which is, do we then expect this traditional cleavage that's been looked at for unemployment benefits, for pensions, for education, for various kinds of welfare state benefits, would we expect this to translate directly onto a universal basic income? And in a way, this is what the paper that I'm discussing today tries to bring to the debate, right? To try and apply this framework to the universal basic income, preferences of different people. Of course, there's other factors. People who have higher skills and higher educations might also be more able to adapt to labor market restructuring and be more resilient, and perhaps would benefit less from a universal basic income, although that's debated. And then age and gender, very important dimensions. Typically, you could imagine that people who are younger in many European countries tend to be more precarious in the labor market. They've accumulated less welfare state entitlements. They're less well protected by existing welfare state institutions. And so they could perhaps stand to benefit more from a universal basic income. And similarly with gender, there's been arguments that women tend to be exposed to all sorts of labor market changes over a lifetime, perhaps to do with asymmetries in family and care responsibilities, and that these shocks then would make them perhaps more favorable to universal basic income. Now, notice what I'm doing here is I'm not making a claim about what is, I'm making a claim about what we could expect, but we don't know because prior to this paper, people hadn't been looking at whether or not these kinds of factors led people to be more or less opposed to a universal basic income. Now, so far, so good in terms of what the political economy literature to date would make us expect. But we do have two complications here that I just want to highlight. One is that we're talking about a policy that doesn't yet exist, or for the most part doesn't yet exist, or for most people doesn't yet exist, right? And so, whereas if I ask someone, do you want more or less unemployment benefits in a society where a benefit exists, they have a pretty good idea of what an unemployment can people form reasonably coherent views about policies that are not in existence, right? If you describe a potential policy, would they be able to form a reasonably coherent view about it? What kind of preferences do they have about that? And then the second complication is concerning the specifics of it. The devil is in the detail. And why, in this case, it's especially true, is because the actual redistributive impact of a universal basic income does not merely depend on the level at which you set the basic income. So imagine I say everyone receives 400 euros a month, for instance. Well, that doesn't tell you actually who benefits and who loses, because two additional issues arise. One is who's paying for financing the basic income, right? So if I were to finance it very aggressively, that might actually make people who receive it worse off, not better off. And two, do you then reform existing welfare state benefits, and how do you do so? So imagine I'm I'm on unemployment benefits in France. And in France, there's a relatively high replacement rate, which means that if I was on a high income when I was working, I would get a relatively high unemployment benefit. Now, if you were to say to that individual, I'm going to give you 600-700 euros a month as a basic income, but I'm going to completely cut the structure of the unemployment benefit system, that particular individual might actually lose under certain conditions, right? And so that makes it quite complicated to then predict how different individuals might or might not, favor or oppose basic income. Okay, so then the question becomes, given that we have these different dimensions, different potential cleavages that allow us to theorize how individuals with different characteristics might oppose or favor a basic income, how should we go about testing those expectations? Well, in the European Social Survey, which many of you might be familiar with, you have every 2 years since the 2000s a survey covering quite a large number of European countries. And in every wave, they introduce certain questions that they always have, and they introduce new questions that before were not there. And in the 2016 edition, you had for the first time in the ESS a question about a universal basic income, which I have here on the slide, where respondents across these European countries, which I'll list in a second, were asked about whether they would be against or in favor of a universal basic income scheme that would be introduced in their respective countries, which would have particular characteristics. And in these characteristics, you can see both details of things that are relatively uncontentious, right, that match the definition that I had on the earlier slide. Things like, that it would be paid by the government, and it would be a monthly income, and it would be covering essential living costs. That in itself, not super controversial. There's other bits of the definition of the listing here that is actually, perhaps a bit more contentious. Number two, it replaces many of the social benefits. That means that you're priming benefit recipient perhaps to worry about whether or not they would be left better off or worse off by the introduction of a UBI. You've got number three, that's less contentious, but the question is, how do people interpret what the minimum standard of living is? Number four is the unconditional aspect of it, so that's good that it's in there. Number five is the fact that it's not means tested in a way, so you can work alongside it. There's no penalty. It's, universal and completely unconditional. Number six appears relatively straightforward. The scheme is paid for by taxes, but actually, then the question becomes, which taxes? Is it corporate taxes, income taxes? Is it, social contributions? But nevertheless, I think, the question has the benefit of being asked to all these respondents across all these countries, and we can then think about the ways in which perhaps people in different countries and different groups respond to this. You can see here already that you have a kind of more people in favor than against, and slightly more people strongly against than strongly in favor. But overall, you have close to a majority. It's not totally statistically significant at that level, who are in favor, strongly in favor, and a kind of very big minority. We're talking 52-48 kind of split, but are against. But then you can also look at differences across countries, which is what these slides show. On the x-axis, you see acronyms for different countries, so Austria, Belgium, Switzerland, Czech Republic, Germany, Estonia, and so on and so forth, all the way to Slovenia. And then on the y-axis here, you see the percentage of people who are either strongly in favor or in favor. Just to give you an example, in Austria, you have something like 45% of respondents who are in favor, strongly in favor, whereas in Lithuania, you have a very high 80%. Notice here that, and we'll say more about this later on in the talk, but notice here that you have quite a big variation across country. And this variation across countries is not necessarily cut according to particularly well-established blocks, right? So it's not the case that in all Central and Eastern European countries it's very high or it's very low. It's not necessarily the case that in all continental Western countries you get a particular pattern. You have variation here which doesn't completely match what we know from a literature on welfare state regimes, for instance, by S.P. Anderson, where you have the Scandinavian welfare state regime being more generous, and perhaps the liberal market economy, the liberal welfare regimes, UK, Ireland, US, less generous, and then Eastern European countries perhaps as a separate kind of regime, right? So you don't really see this in the cross-national variation. Now, what I do next is I try and evaluate the probability that an individual in a given country is supportive or against a universal basic income as defined in the previous slide. Because there's a lot of variation across countries, you need to use a method that kind of absorbs this variation, because you don't want your individual level results to be polluted by cross-country variation. So what I do is I first estimate a model where I try and think about how individual level factors make you more or less likely to support a basic income, while absorbing the cross-national heterogeneity of country fixed effects, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. And then in the second step, I try and look at the variation across countries and whether controlling for individual level differences within each country, whether there's something in the country setup that makes you more or less likely that makes these people more or less likely to support the basic income. The second question is harder to solve than the first one because we don't have very many countries, right? So it's very hard to estimate what's explaining the variation across countries when you only have, under 30 countries at one given point in time to do so. But it's nevertheless interesting to try and do some exploratory work on this. Okay, so this graph packs quite a lot of information in one place. So I want to spend a few minutes just to explain what it tells us and how to interpret this. So what it does is that, imagine you run regressions of support or opposition to basic incomes on individual level characteristics to try and ascertain how people who are of different genders, different ages, different incomes, how those characteristics makes them more or less supportive of a basic income. And suppose that you then, for each characteristic, try and plot the effect of that characteristic on the probability of support for basic income. That's the graph you would get. So for instance, you could look at the first row, which is male respondents. This is a self-declared gender question. So it's people who declare themselves to be male, are more likely, so the coefficient is positive, to support a basic income. So this is a little bit puzzling because you remember from what I said early on, you would have expected that controlling for everything else, perhaps women would be more favorable to a basic income. The circle here is the size of the coefficient that you can read on the x-axis. And the line around the circle is the so-called confidence intervals. In cases where this line overlaps with this vertical zero line, that means that you don't have a statistically significant effect. You can think of this as basically the characteristic has no effect. So what you find is that older people tend to be less supportive of a basic income. People who have higher years of education tends to be more supportive. People with higher incomes are less supportive. Income from self-employment, farming, and pension has no effect on the probability of supporting a basic income. People who are benefit recipients, think of unemployment benefits or think of social assistance benefits tend to be more supportive. Here we have a slightly interesting results. These are professionals, technicians, and so on. These are questions about your occupation. So you can classify respondents according to what kind of occupation they're in. And you have occupations that are more or less high skilled. So it goes all the way from an elementary worker and an operator to a professional and managerial category. Here what you see is that it is indeed the case that people who are craft workers and operators of machines and elementary service workers are more favorable, but there's something going on also with the so-called professional class, where here you also see that for some reason they're also quite favorable to basic income. If I go towards the bottom part of the graph, you see trade union membership has no effect. Now this is very interesting and it depends on the countries. You have a bit of a tension within the left on this, but I'm going to go on to talk about a bit more later. And then you have self-placement on the left-right scale. And what it shows is the more you declare yourself to be right-wing, you know, in terms of your attitudes, the less favorable you are to basic income. Now, this is important because it shows that even though you do have some people who have certain, you know, that can be higher incomes or higher classes, although you do have some people who, like this who support a basic income, if you ask people to self-place themselves ideologically, it is the case that if you say you're more right-wing, you're less likely to support a basic income. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk more about what that means in terms of predicted probability. You know, for each of these factors, you can calculate predicted probabilities by taking the minimum and the maximum values of the variable. I'm not going to give you many examples unless they're of interest in the Q&A perhaps, but I just want to give you an example. For instance, an 18-year-old individual in this sample across all these countries has almost a 60% probability of supporting a basic income compared to 47% for a 65-year-old person. Now, this is an average, right? This is not a deterministic claim. Obviously, you have variation in every age group. You're going to have people who are very supportive and very opposed in all age groups. But as an average, this is what we find in the sample. Okay, there's a bunch of robustness checks that one can do, looking at different kinds of ways of thinking about labor market risks, different kinds of thinking about trade union memberships, and doing different kinds of estimation methods and models. I don't want to bore you with these details, you know, ex ante, but if it is something that would be of interest, I'm very happy to chat about it in the Q&A. 2 extensions, and I'll mention one here and the second one in the Q&A if it's of interest, because I'm mindful of time. But I think the first important extension is looking at welfare state policies, and in particular, looking at whether or not countries that have more generous benefits tend to have people who are less supportive of a basic income. And one way of looking at this in this graph is to think about 2 measures of generosity. One on the top left-hand side is the so-called net unemployment replacement rate. So how generous the benefit system is when you're unemployed. And here you can see that the more generous your benefit system, the less people are supportive of basic income, presumably because they also already feel pretty secure and safe in the country in which they are. And on the top right-hand side, you see a strictness of sanction rules. This is a measure of so-called activation. Activation is a thing that many countries started doing in the 80s and 90s, where instead of just giving unemployment benefits to people who are out of the labor market, rightly or wrongly, they started believing that you need to incentivize them to return to work. And the way to do that was to introduce all sorts of sanctions and conditions for them to receive benefits. Attending the job centers, doing certain trainings, showing that you're actively searching work, and so on and so forth. And here what you see is that the more the country has activated the unemployment benefit system, the more people controlling for everything else tend to be supportive of the basic income. Role of ideology, looking at how attitudes are correlated with attitudes is always a tricky enterprise methodologically, and you should always be wary when you do this because you have very strong endogeneity concerns. Still, it's quite interesting descriptively to look at this and just to note that people who are more trusting of institutions in general are more likely to favor universal basic income. People who are more pro-immigration also tend to support universal basic income. That's an interesting finding and not necessarily an obvious one. And then you can explore whether or not the cleavage structure of a basic income, is it similar or different from other kinds of welfare state benefits we have and other kinds of redistribution attitudes. Now, the ESS has all sorts of questions on whether or not you want to live in a more equal society, whether you want more welfare state benefits, whether you think that benefit recipients are deserving. And we can find that all these kind of pro-welfare state markers are highly correlated with support for basic income, which means that people who like the welfare state in general are also more likely to favor a basic income, even when you control for other income and occupational characteristics of these individuals. So I think this is an important thing to mention. Okay, I have about a few minutes left, and in those few minutes, I just want to talk about why I think these findings are important from a scholarly perspective, but also perhaps for the policy debate. So I think this paper is part of a wave of new papers now. There's at least 4 or 5 now, and more counting every year, trying to go beyond just discussing the normative desirability and the economic feasibility and the effects of a UBI, to think about why it is that certain individuals might or might not support basic income. Because at the end of the day, in most countries, in most democracies, you get policies not because they're economically desirable and not because they're normatively desirable, but you get them because the majority of the electorate wants them. And one can have a position whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, depending on the issue and the discussion. But certainly it is the case that you don't always get things just because there's a good philosophical justification for them, right? And so I think that paper tries to add a first step in our understanding to try and think about the political feasibility of a UBI. I also think it's interesting in terms of thinking about how people form expectations, that the political economy expectations we had for existing welfare state policies actually do a good job at explaining basic income support, even though it does not yet exist, right? So people have reasonably well-formed preferences about things, right? So it's not the case that it's sort of completely random. I think there's a more general puzzle here, which is that you have this very famous work by Coppi and Palm in the late 1990s, making the case, or was it early 2000s perhaps, making the case that universal benefits are more politically appealing because everyone receives them. So to have a generous welfare state, you need to have a universal welfare state, because it's only when it's universal or relatively encompassing that many people benefit from it and end up supporting greater generosity, right? And I think that's probably right, but in the case of basic income, it then poses a puzzle, which is how come then we don't have more support, or how come we don't have a basic income? I mean, it's the most universal policy you could imagine, so it should have a very high level of support. There's at least three possible solutions. One has to do with the politics of the welfare state on the perceived or real austerity, right? Rightly or wrongly, the electorate and governments think that perhaps there is no fiscal capacity to implement it. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that you have fiscal capacity and you have a large demand in terms of the electorate, but perhaps political parties, for whatever reasons, don't find it appealing to introduce a policy. Maybe it's splitting the electorate in certain ways that makes it unappealing. Maybe they have other priorities and therefore it never gets proposed. But I think one implication of this research agenda that I was talking about today is that actually maybe we have multiple conflict lines in the support correlation in the demand side. And what I mean by that is perhaps the ways the electorate is structured in terms of the support for basic income makes it a problem. And in particular, in this case, I think what's going on is that although you have a wide appeal for a basic income in total, this comes from different parts of the electorate. And so what happens is the following: trade union members and trade union leaderships tend to be more skeptical of a UBI in many countries, whether or not their right to be skeptical is a separate question. And as a result, the left, which traditionally is the architect of welfare state expansions, need to draw on other parts of the electorate to form a majoritarian coalition that overtakes opposition from parts of their own coalition or traditional supporters, right? So because they maybe don't have the support from trade union members and trade unions, they need to go in the center right. And the center right has people who like a universal basic income, but not necessarily for the same reasons and not necessarily in the same version as someone who is on the left. And therefore, you've got this paradox that perhaps you have a large support, but people have very different ideas of what the basic income ought to do. And therefore, you had a bit of a kind of status quo bias up until now. Now, the question then becomes, in a post-COVID world, will we have something that makes it more or less likely to overcome this political gridlock that you get on the left? And I think the jury is still out in a sense, or is still not out, because you have a clash of titans. On the one hand, you've got increasing political demands, so people have been made more insecure. A crisis often constitutes critical junctures. You've got technological restructuring. You've got all sorts of issues in the labor markets. Perhaps the welfare state is no longer up to the task, right? So that's increasing demand. But at the same time, after the money we spent in COVID, you have more limited fiscal capacity. Perhaps, we've already innovated so much in what we did to deal with COVID that perhaps there's no longer reform capacity. And indeed, maybe other issues are more salient. Think the environment, think health policy, and so on and so forth, right? So in a way, you get this tension. And what you see here is that during COVID, as you will remember, you had lots of even traditional newspapers, Wall Street Journal, CNN, and even more medical literature discussing how UBI could be the solution. And it did seem to be that compared to the ESS, newer surveys suggest an uptick, but in the end, it sort of didn't really deliver, at least up until now. So I'm mindful of time, so I'll just stop here, and I thank you very much for your attention. I just want to direct you to some of the papers here in case you want to read more about this. But thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim.